All right, folks, this is 18-3. 18-3 is the pituitary gland, and this is the master endocrine organ. All right, so a little bit of anatomy here. You know the pituitary gland sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, so this is the sella turcica of the sphenoid. Uh, you probably already know that there's an anterior pituitary lobe and a posterior pituitary lobe. The posterior pituitary lobe stores ADH and oxytocin made by the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary lobe makes a whole bunch of tropic hormones, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes. So this is the pituitary gland. You can see some pituitary histology here. You can see that the posterior lobe actually looks like nervous tissue, whereas the anterior lobe looks like epithelial tissue, which is what most of the endocrine glands are made of. Or I should say, all of the endocrine glands are made of epithelial tissue. So there's the histology of the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. Okay, I guess before I go on, I don't see the words here. The anterior pituitary gland is sometimes known as the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary gland is known as the neurohypophysis. So adenohypophysis is another name for anterior pituitary, and adeno is another name for anterior, and neurohypophysis is another name for the posterior.
The hypothalamus is sometimes referred to as the master control center of the endocrine system because it regulates most endocrine functions of the body. Located at the base of the brain in the anterior portion of the diencephalon, the hypothalamus consists of several groups of neurons called nuclei, each with specific functions. The stalk-like infundibulum connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland or hypophysis. The pituitary gland sits within the hypophyseal fossa of the sphenoid bone and is divided into anterior and posterior lobes. Each lobe of the pituitary gland interacts with the hypothalamus in a different way. The anterior pituitary, or adenohypophysis, is connected to the hypothalamus by a blood vessel network known as the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Hormones released by the hypothalamus travel through the portal system and regulate activities of the anterior pituitary. In contrast, the posterior pituitary, or neurohypophysis, is connected to the hypothalamus by neurons that form the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Axons of these neurons transport hormones from the hypothalamus for storage in the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is regulated by two classes of hypothalamic hormones, releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. These hormones reach the anterior pituitary via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system and stimulate or suppress secretion of anterior pituitary hormones. Hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary then enter the bloodstream for distribution to their specific target tissues. For example, thyrotropin-releasing hormones secreted by the hypothalamus stimulates thyrotropic cells of the anterior pituitary to increase secretion of thyroid-stimulating hormone, which then regulates activity of the thyroid gland. The posterior pituitary produces no hormones of its own. Rather, neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus synthesize two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, known as ADH or vasopressin, and oxytocin, that are transported to the posterior pituitary via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. These hormones are stored in nerve terminals in the posterior pituitary and released into the blood upon stimulation of the axons. Each hormone has distinct functions. ADH acts on the kidneys to increase water retention from renal tubules. It also acts to constrict blood vessels. Oxytocin causes smooth muscle contraction in both the male and female reproductive tracts. It also stimulates milk ejection by the lactating mammary glands.
All right, so that's the link between the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Now, this picture is basically what the movie just showed you. Um, what we have here is the portal system. Let me remind you what a portal system is so you can see the word portal vessels here. The portal system, if you have a capillary bed, you can see this capillary bed right here. And normally what you probably remember from Bio 203 is you have an artery going into a capillary bed and a vein draining it. But what happens if you have an artery, capillary bed, vein, capillary bed? Well, in that case, the vein between the two capillary beds is called a portal vein. And you probably remember the, well, actually, you probably don't. We do digestive system this semester. I'll be talking about the hepatic portal vein quite a bit in the future. Well, this is the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So this is a portal vein between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And this is how the hormones from the hypothalamus get to the anterior pituitary. They're secreted into these capillary beds, and then they're transported to these capillary beds, and then they get to these cells and tell these cells what to do. So there's a portal system between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. The connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary is this tract. These are nerves. Now remember, the posterior pituitary simply stores two hormones, oxytocin and ADH, that are made by the hypothalamus. In fact, they're made by these two nuclei of the hypothalamus, paraventricular nuclei and supraoptic nuclei. They make ADH and oxytocin. Those hormones are transported down these axons and stored in these terminal boutons. That's where they're stored. And then upon stimulation, they're secreted into the bloodstream. All right, so that's the portal system and the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tracts. All right, the hypothalamus secretes. This is a typical secretion mechanism, typical axis. The hypothalamus secretes releasing hormones, which travel to the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland releases tropic hormones, which another word for tropic is stimulating. And the stimulating hormone or tropic hormone goes to the effector endocrine organ, which tells it to secrete its hormone. So this could be the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. It could be the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It could be the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. It all depends on what organ we're talking about down here. So these are axes, and the word tropic and stimulating are sometimes used interchangeably. For example, thyrotropin equals thyroid stimulating hormone. So you can see that the word tropic or tropin means stimulating. Now what happens is after the ultimate hormone is secreted, it feeds back a negative feedback and shuts down the pituitary and shuts down the hypothalamus. And we actually showed this in one of the first slides of this chapter, but this is the negative feedback self-regulating reflex. All right, now sometimes the hypothalamus secretes inhibiting hormones. There's not as many inhibiting hormones as there are releasing hormones, but there are a few. Like there's a growth hormone inhibiting hormone, there's a prolactin inhibiting hormone. So here's an inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, would tell the anterior pituitary, don't make prolactin. Whereas PRF, prolactin releasing factor, would tell the anterior pituitary, do make prolactin. And then what does prolactin do? Prolactin goes down to the mammary glands and says, hey, make some milk. So that's the prolactin story. Now notice that it's not the prolactin from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland is not going to an effector endocrine organ. It's actually going directly to the tissue that does something for us. So we don't always have these tropic hormones going to an effector endocrine organ. Sometimes we have hormones that go out and directly do a job. Okay, so that's an inhibiting hormone. So we have releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. Here's another example. I think I already mentioned it. You have growth hormone inhibiting hormone and growth hormone releasing hormone. So we have this. And now growth hormone can itself go out there and tell things to grow. They can affect cells and increase their growth. But they also go to the liver and turn on the production of somatomedins. And somatomedins cause growth of certain tissues, like the epiphyseal growth plate of bones and muscles and things like this. When I say the epiphyseal growth plates of bones, pause, break, and the growth of muscles. It's not like muscles have epiphyseal growth plates. They don't. All right, so this is growth hormone inhibiting hormone and growth hormone releasing hormone. Here's a collage showing you that in general there's releasing hormones that cause the release of tropic hormones. And you can see that right here, that you have thyrotropin releasing hormone, which goes to the pituitary and turns on thyrotropin, also known as thyroid stimulating hormone, which goes to the thyroid and tells the thyroid to make thyroid hormones, which is typically T4. It can also be some T3 as well, but typically T4. In addition, we have corticotropin releasing hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary to make adrenocorticotropic hormone, which tells the adrenal cortex to make cortisol, a glucocorticoid. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid. In addition, we have gonadotropin releasing hormone, which cause the anterior pituitary to release these two gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. What do? Follicle stimulating hormone goes to the testes if you're a man, the ovaries if you're a female, and they say make eggs or sperm. Now, when I say make eggs or sperm, a female is born with all the eggs she's ever going to have, but finish making eggs in that case, and I'll tell you the details about that in chapter 28. So for right now, we'll just say FSH says make eggs and sperm, depending if you're a man or a woman. What does luteinizing hormone do? Luteinizing hormone goes to the testes if you're a man and says make testosterone, androgens like testosterone, and estrogens and progesterones if you're a female from the ovaries. So that's how these things work.
Hormonal communication generally begins with a part of the neuroendocrine system receiving sensory information and reacting by issuing a command to the body in the form of a hormone. In this example, dehydration is detected by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which then directs or stimulates the posterior pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone, ADH. The next step is to transport the hormone molecules to target cells. This is typically done via the bloodstream. Here, ADH is transported through the bloodstream to the kidneys and blood vessels. When hormone molecules reach target cells, they will bind to matching receptors on those cells, and the hormone receptor complexes will trigger changes in the target cells. This causes the kidneys to reduce the urine volume output, thereby increasing water retention and countering dehydration. In blood vessels, vasoconstriction is increased, leading to higher blood pressure and thus countering the blood pressure drop caused by dehydration.
In fact, you can see now why ADH is sometimes called vasopressin. Vaso for vessels, blood vessels, vaso, pressin for pressure. So if ADH, also known as vasopressin, causes vasoconstriction, pressure on the blood vessels, then it increases blood pressure. So that's why ADH has two names, antidiuretic hormone and vasopressin, because it affects the kidneys and blood vessels. So you can see that there. Now, this picture is on your slide. This picture is on your slide. Of course, this picture is on your slide. This picture is on your slide. This picture is on your test. And I'm going to try not to say that in lab because, of course, I want you to listen to these lectures. I'm hoping you are. I might cave and say it, but I'm going to actually try not to. This picture is on your test, but it's not filled in. These hormones, these tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary, they're all missing. And then these organs here, or glands, are shown. And then what they do is missing. So you need to memorize all these hormones and all these axes. Now you have to memorize them for lab anyway. And I'm telling you, you have to memorize them for lecture. And it seems like a daunting task, but it really isn't if you just did 5 at a time and mastered that, and then did 5 more and mastered that, and then did 5 more and mastered that. So this, and you can follow the axes, and you should understand the axes. For example, you should know that CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, goes down and tells the pituitary to secrete ACTH. ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex and says secrete cortisol. So you see the adrenal cortex right here, and it secretes cortisol. So this is the CRH ACTH cortisol story. That's what that is. Let's do thyroid. TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary. TRH causes the anterior pituitary to make thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes to the thyroid gland and tells it to make T3 and T4. Let's do one of the gonadotropins. GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, goes to the anterior pituitary and says, hey, let's make some LH. And here's LH. LH goes down to the testes if you're a male and the ovaries if you're a female and says, hey, make testosterone or estrogen. So that's the GnRH, LH, testosterone, estrogen story. So you can see that there's all these axes here, and you do need to know these. You need to memorize these, and it does start to make sense. And the endocrine system is a huge homeostatic system for our body, and you need to understand these hormones and how they work and how they interact. All right, so this picture is on your next exam. All right, the posterior pituitary only stores hormones. It stores them at the end of these axons. The hormones are actually made in the hypothalamus. I think I've said that probably a dozen times by now. So what happens is the hypothalamus makes ADH and oxytocin, stores them down here in the end of their axons, and upon stimulation, these axons secrete ADH or oxytocin. So what's that stimulation? Well, it depends. You have osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus that detect the osmolality or osmolarity of your blood, and if you become too salty, i.e. dehydrated, then you stimulate the posterior pituitary to release ADH. ADH goes to the kidneys and says increase water retention. Now you're rehydrated. Whereas if you have some other stimulation, sensory stimulation, and by the way, this is more complicated than I'm going to make it sound right now because I do this in chapter 28. Lots of things that can actually turn on oxytocin. For example, a baby nursing on mom turns on this oxytocin release. There's childbirth turns on oxytocin release. It's actually a positive feedback mechanism that we'll talk about. But with proper stimulation, oxytocin can be released from the posterior pituitary, and that causes smooth muscle contraction, like smooth muscles in the uterus, smooth muscles in the prostate gland. It also causes milk letdown or milk ejection. We usually say milk letdown. Just so you know, I said that the baby's nursing can start this oxytocin release. In fact, just the sound of a baby crying can actually cause oxytocin release and milk letdown. And if you're a mom, you probably experienced this before. After you gave birth, it might not even have been your baby that was crying, and some milk would be released from your breast. So it's not the suckling or the breastfeeding directly, sometimes it can actually be the sound of a baby crying. So I have a lot more. I have more of a story about oxytocin, but I'll tell it a little bit later, and likely I'll tell it in chapter 28. And again, this picture is on your test. This is the big collage picture. What we had before was the anterior pituitary, then the posterior pituitary. Now we have the big collage. You must know this picture. All right, so that's the picture that's on the test. This is a table that goes along with that picture. I mean, you can see the where they come from. So you can see where the hormones come from. They tell you what part of the pituitary. They tell you where they go. They tell you the effect. They tell you the hypothalamic regulating hormone that controls it. For example, TSH comes from the anterior pituitary. How do I know? There's the anterior lobe right there. Where does TSH go? Thyroid gland. What does it tell the thyroid gland to do? Make thyroid hormones. When is TSH secreted? When TRH tells it to be. So you can see that there. So both this picture and this table tells you all the hormones of the pituitary, hypothalamus and pituitary. All right, that's the end of 18.3. Next is 18.4.